Power is not always the hand that signs the papers. Sometimes it is the mind that taught the hand where to sign. At 9:42 p.m., snow moved sideways across East Wacker Drive, brushing the glass walls of Oraline workforce strategies like white static on a silent screen. 42 floors above the Chicago River, the city lights glittered in blue, gold, and icy silver, beautiful from a distance and cold enough to make every reflection look expensive. Inside Conference Room 7A, the air smelled faintly of cedar polish, espresso, and winter wool drying under hidden vents. Danica Bexley arrived alone. She wore a deep red tailored coat over a cream high-neck blouse, her black leather gloves folded neatly in one hand, her expression calm enough to make the room correct its posture. At 39, Danica had the kind of beauty that did not ask for attention. It received it quietly, like a sealed letter delivered by hand. She noticed everything. The room held 12 executive chairs, 3 frosted privacy panels, 2 legal observers from Whitman and Rawl Advisory, and 1 sealed graphite folder placed exactly 16 inches from Charles Fenwick's seat. The folder was labeled the Executive Personnel Control File. Inside were succession maps, leadership risk scores, ethics triggers, and the first draft of an executive conduct reversion instrument Danica had designed 7 years earlier, when Fenwick Group still needed borrowed ethics to impress its investors. No one thanked the architect once the house became famous. Charles entered at 9:47 p.m. in a navy Brioni suit, polished Tom Ford shoes, and a watch worth more than Danica's childhood home on South Calumet Avenue. His smile was camera-ready even without cameras, the trained smile of a man who believed every room was a stage and every woman beside him was part of the lighting. Behind him came Audra Phelps in a champagne silk dress, pale against the dark glass, bright against the snow, smiling as if the evening had been arranged for her arrival. Danica looked once. That was enough. Charles crossed the room with the easy confidence of a man who had mistaken permission for ownership, then paused beside Danica without touching her shoulder. Beyond the glass, headlights crawled along Michigan Avenue like a line of patient witnesses, each one briefly appearing, then disappearing into the storm. The marriage between Danica and Charles had become like that too. Impressive from far away, empty up close. "You're early," he said. Danica checked the clock built into the wall panel. "I'm on time." 3 members of the advisory team lowered their eyes to their tablets. Kira Donnelly, Danica's assistant, stood near the presentation console with a slim binder pressed to her chest, her face composed but tense. Kira had worked for Danica for 6 years, long enough to know when silence meant patience and when silence meant measurement. Tonight, Danica was measuring. Charles gestured toward Audra as if introducing a new acquisition. "Audra will observe tonight," he said, smooth and careless. "She's helping me refine the human side of the initiative." The phrase sounded polished, but Danica heard the hollow center. The Humane Empire Initiative was scheduled to be announced at 8 a.m. The next morning, backed by a $28 million communications spend, a Forbes leadership profile, and a private investor briefing promising a new era of ethical workforce stewardship. Danica had built the workforce stewardship model. Charles had built the speech. The difference mattered. Audra moved closer to the table and let her fingers rest near the sealed graphite folder, not touching it, but close enough to perform importance. Snow thickened outside, turning the windows into a dark theater of moving white. The city looked alive. The room felt preserved. "This is a limited access file," Kira said gently. Audra gave Kira a bright, empty smile. "Then it's good I'm no longer limited." The sentence landed softly, but everyone understood its purpose. Charles did not correct her. He only adjusted his cuff and glanced at Danica, waiting for the old version of his wife to absorb the insult quietly for the sake of his image. Danica's face did not change. She had been born far from rooms like this, raised by a mother who counted bus fare in quarters and still taught her daughter to speak as if every room could belong to her. Scholarships had carried Danica through schools where people praised resilience but rarely invited it to dinner. Discipline had carried her further. By the time Charles found her, she had already learned the oldest rule of American wealth. Every polished empire has someone unseen holding the weight. Tonight, Charles seemed determined to prove it. On the table, the graphite folder waited beneath a narrow strip of light, holding terms no one in the room fully understood except the woman they had mistaken for decoration. Human capital governance lien, ethics breach equity holdback, source logic custody warrant, and reputation risk recapture protocol. Danica did not reach for it. Not yet. She simply removed her gloves, placed them beside her notebook, and looked through the glass at the snow falling over Chicago, calm as a verdict that had not been read aloud. At 9:53 p.m., the snow thickened until the lights of Michigan Avenue looked blurred behind a sheet of white glass. Inside Conference Room 7A, the ceiling lamps washed Charles Fenwick in a clean corporate glow, making his Brioni lapels shine, while his smile rested easy and entertained. Across the table, half outside the light, Danica Bexley sat still beside the dark window, her reflection layered over the frozen city like a second witness. The room split itself in two. Charles leaned back under the warmest pool of light, amused by the discomfort he had allowed, while Danica remained near the corner where the glass turned black and the snow made no sound. Audra Phelps stood beside the sealed graphite folder as if proximity could become authority, her champagne silk dress catching every lamp, every glance, every fragile piece of attention she needed to feel real. Kira Donnelly kept both hands around her slim binder, close enough for Danica to see the pressure whitening her knuckles. "You can wait outside," Audra said. No one moved. The advisory clock changed to 9:54 p.m., and the digital red line on the wall panel marked the meeting as officially recorded under private governance review. Two legal observers from Whitman and Rawl Advisory looked down at their tablets, not because they missed the insult, but because people paid $1,200 an hour sometimes learn to hide recognition behind screens. Charles gave a small laugh, soft enough to sound harmless and cruel enough to be remembered. "Audra is just trying to streamline the room," he said. Danica looked at him then, not with surprise, but with the cold patience of someone watching a signature approach the wrong line. Beyond the glass, the Chicago River reflected broken gold from office towers, and a gust of snow scraped the window with a sound like paper dragged across stone. Kira swallowed once. Audra stepped closer and tapped the edge of Kira's binder with one manicured finger, a small gesture made large by the silence around it. "This level of discussion is for principals," Audra said, smiling toward Charles before returning her eyes to Kira. "Support staff should know when a room has outgrown them." The words did not shout. They performed. Charles did not stop her. He only tilted his head, entertained by the idea that his new favorite woman could diminish the old structures without understanding who had built them. Danica noticed the graphite folder's tamper seal, the matte gray polymer strip stamped with Oraline's private governance mark. That seal protected the executive personnel control file, including succession maps, compensation risk ledgers, leadership exposure notes, and the dormant clauses Charles had approved without reading closely. Human capital governance lien, ethics breach equity holdback, source logic custody warrant, reputation risk recapture protocol. Wealth often trusted paper more than people. Audra reached for the folder. Kira gently shifted her binder forward, blocking the movement by barely 2 inches, polite enough to appear accidental and firm enough to be understood. "Miss Phelps is not cleared for that file," Kira said. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 5 degrees. Charles's smile stayed in the light, but his eyes hardened, and in the darker corner Danica's face remained smooth, elegant, unreadable. Audra's cheeks colored faintly under the lamps, not from shame, but from being corrected by someone she believed was beneath her. She lifted Kira's binder from the table, removed the small graphite authorization sleeve clipped to the front, and bent it between 2 fingers until its corners split cleanly. The only sound was the cold crack of the graphite sleeve breaking in Audra's hand. Kira's breath caught. Danica's did not. Charles gave another quiet laugh, the kind used in country clubs and boardrooms when powerful men wanted harm to sound like etiquette. "Let's not make this dramatic," he said. Danica looked from the broken sleeve to the graphite folder, then to Audra's empty smile, then finally to Charles, who still believed the meeting was about image control. At 9:58 p.m., the first alert appeared silently on the wall panel. Private governance file integrity event logged. Audra did not understand the phrase. Charles did not notice it quickly enough. Danica did, and for the first time that night, she placed one hand flat on the table, her diamond ring catching no light because she had turned it inward. The snow outside kept falling over Chicago, beautiful and indifferent, while inside the room a marriage lost its last useful illusion. Noted, Danica said. At 10:01 p.m. The broken graphite authorization sleeve still lay near Kira's binder, its split corner facing the ceiling like a small, open wound. Charles remained beneath the warm ceiling light, smiling as though the room had merely witnessed an awkward social moment, while Danica sat near the black glass where the snow erased half of Chicago into silence. The split screen of the marriage was almost perfect. He was bright, amused, and careless under the lamps. She was still, shadowed, and more present than anyone who had spoken. "We should continue," Charles said. Danica did not answer. Outside, East Wacker Drive had turned white along the curb, and the headlights below moved at 15 miles per hour through the storm, slow enough to make the city look cautious. Inside, the advisory clock blinked 10:02 p.m., and the wall panel kept its quiet red notation, "Private Governance File Integrity Event Logged." Audra touched the broken sleeve as if she could turn the moment back into theater, but the fractured edge had already told the room what her voice could not undo. Kira stood motionless. Danica rose without pushing back her chair loudly, without gathering attention, without giving Charles the public emotion he could later rename as instability. She picked up her black leather gloves, aligned them once against the edge of her notebook, and closed the cover with 2 fingers. The only sound was the soft click of Danica's notebook clasp sealing shut. Charles's smile faltered for less than a second. Audra looked relieved, mistaking Danica's quiet exit for the kind of defeat she understood. Danica reached into the inside pocket of her coat and removed an ivory file clip, smooth, old, and too plain for a room trained to worship expensive things. The clip had been with her since graduate school in Boston, back when her rent was $875 a month. Her winter coat came from a discount rack, and her name on every application was still Danica Rowe. She placed it in the center of the table, directly beside the executive personnel control file. The engraved letters caught the narrow light. D. Rowe. Charles saw the name and frowned as though history had spoken out of turn. "Danica," he said, low and careful, "don't make a symbol out of this." She looked at him across the polished table, past the lamps, past Audra's silk, past the moneyed confidence he wore like a second jacket. In the bright half of the room, Charles sat framed by walnut panels and legal observers, a man still convinced power meant staying seated. In the dark half of the glass, Danica's reflection stood over the snow-covered city, calm enough to make absence feel like command. "You already did," she said. 3 legal observers stopped typing. Kira's eyes lowered to the ivory clip, and something in her face steadied, not because she knew what came next, but because she knew Danica did. Charles exhaled through his nose, almost laughing again, trying to recover the tone that had carried him through boardrooms, interviews, and apologies written by other people. "This room does not run on sentiment," he said. Danica turned her wedding ring inward with her thumb until the diamond faced her palm, hidden from the light. She did not remove it. She did not need to. The gesture was smaller than anger and colder than accusation. On the wall panel, a second line appeared under the first. Governance chain disruption captured under executive conduct reversion instrument. Audra blinked at the words. Charles finally saw them. Danica adjusted the cuff of her coat and glanced once at Kira, not as a rescue signal, but as a promise held in plain sight. Kira understood and stayed where she was. That mattered. A woman like Danica did not drag loyal people through broken rooms. She built doors they could walk through later with their own names intact. At 10:06 p.m., Danica stepped away from the table. The snow beyond the glass thickened, and the city lights behind her turned into blurred gold threads stitched through darkness. Charles stood halfway, his chair legs pressing into the carpet with a dull scrape, but he did not know whether to command her, stop her, or perform concern for the people watching. "Where are you going?" he asked. Danica paused at the frosted glass door, one hand resting lightly on the brushed steel handle. The handle clicked once under her palm, clean and final. She looked back at Charles, then at Audra, then at the broken graphite sleeve beside the file. "You wanted authority," she said. "Keep the room." The door opened without drama, and cold hallway air slipped in, smelling faintly of snow, elevator metal, and winter coats. Danica walked out at 10:07 p.m., leaving the ivory clip, the inward-turned ring, and a room full of people who had not yet understood that her silence was not surrender. It was notice. At 6:18 a.m., Chicago was still blue with winter, and the snow along East Wacker Drive had hardened into pale ridges beside the curb. Charles Fenwick stood in his private communications suite on the 38th floor of Fenwick Group, under a ring of soft studio lights prepared for his 8 a.m. Humane Empire Initiative briefing, laughing lightly at a note his PR chief had placed on a teleprompter. Across the city, 8 blocks away, Danica Bexley sat in the unlit corner office of Oraline Workforce Strategies, calm beside a dark window where the river looked like black glass beneath the falling snow. The screen had split again. Charles was warm, polished, amused beneath curated light. Danica was quiet in the blue edge of dawn, with only the city's cold glow touching her face. At 6:21 a.m., his first email arrived with the subject line written in the delicate language of expensive consequence. Notice of Executive Conduct Reversion Instrument Review. Charles smiled at first, because men like him often believed formal words were decorations until they became locks. He opened the message with one hand, coffee in the other, and read that Oraline was initiating a private governance review into unauthorized influence over senior personnel access, file integrity disruption, and non-cleared interference during a recorded leadership risk session. This is procedural, he said. No one agreed quickly enough. His general counsel, Marston Pike, arrived at 6:29 a.m., with his coat still wet at the shoulders, carrying a tablet and the expression of a man who had read the last page before anyone else. The PR team stood frozen near the glass wall, where morning headlights crawled along Michigan Avenue at 12 miles per hour, and every tower window burned like a separate warning. Charles waved toward the teleprompter and said they were not moving the briefing. Marston did not sit. You may not have authority to proceed. The words landed without volume, and the room changed shape around them. Charles's smile stayed under the ring light, thinner now, while in Oraline's dark office Danica opened a matte black signing console and reviewed the final acquisition packet for Oraline's controlling equity tranche, 61.8%, settled through Rome Meridian Holdings at 5:44 a.m., closing value $312 million. She had not bought Oraline overnight or in anger. She had spent 11 quiet months assembling the controlling tranche, and that morning only made the ownership visible. The only sound was the precise glass tap of Danica's stylus sealing the final equity transfer. A timestamp appeared in the lower corner, 6:33 and 17 seconds Central Standard Time. The acquisition confirmed her authority over the human capital governance lien, the ethics breach equity holdback, and the source logic custody warrant attached to Fenwick Group's outsourced leadership architecture. Charles had approved those instruments years earlier as investor assurance language, never imagining they were real levers designed to work when his own conduct became the risk. Investors had trusted her design. Charles had trusted the mirror. At 6:41 a.m., the second notice arrived, freezing discretionary executive bonus disbursements pending review of personal conduct exposure and reputational misalignment. At 6:44 a.m., the third notice suspended Audra Phelps's observer clearance under the reputation risk recapture protocol. At 6:46 a.m., the fourth notice placed the executive personnel control file under source logic custody, removing Charles's ability to alter succession maps, leadership risk scores, and internal ethics triggers. Who authorized this? Charles asked. Marston looked at the document, then at the signature line. The room was bright enough for everyone to see the color leave Charles's face. Danica's name appeared not as Mrs. Fenwick, not as a spouse, not as a ceremonial advisor, but as controlling governor of Oraline Workforce Strategies and trustee of the Roe Governance Reserve. Across the city, Danica folded her hands once on the desk, her wedding ring still turned inward, her red coat hanging untouched over the back of the chair. Snow drifted past the window in slow white layers, and the first morning sun struck the high-rises without warming them. Charles stared at the signature until the ring light above him hummed faintly. Danica did this, he said. In the dark corner office, Danica did not smile. She only watched the city wake beneath the storm, knowing the world would call it a corporate action, while she knew it was something cleaner. It was consequence. At 7:12 a.m., the storm pressed against Chicago with a quiet persistence, layering the sidewalks outside East Wacker Drive in white while the towers above the river glowed like cold lanterns. In Fenwick Group's communications suite, Charles stood beneath the ring lights with a half-smile forced back onto his face, telling his PR chief that no administrative hiccup would interrupt a $28 million public image campaign. 8 blocks away, in Oraline's corner office, Danica sat in the low blue morning light, reviewing the incorporation papers for a new entity bearing a name Charles had once treated like a past she should outgrow. The image divided itself again. Charles laughed under warm lamps, surrounded by cameras, coffee cups, and nervous staff. In the darker edge of another tower, Danica remained still beside the snow-streaked glass, her calm more dangerous than his volume. At 7:16 a.m., Kira Donnelly arrived at Oraline with her coat dusted in snow and her broken graphite authorization sleeve sealed inside a clear evidence pouch. She looked tired, not defeated, and there was a faint red mark on her hand from how tightly she had held her binder the night before. Danica did not offer pity. She offered a chair, a warm paper cup from Intelligentsia, and a position title printed on cream stationery with raised black lettering. Interim Founding Operations Director, Roe Women's Workforce Trust. For 90 days, the title would be provisional. After that, Kira would keep it because the work proved what Danica already knew. Kira read it twice. "This is mine?" she asked. Danica's answer was simple. "You earned it." The trust had been prepared quietly for 11 months, funded by a $46 million reserve that Charles had dismissed as Danica's social impact hobby during a dinner on Oak Street. He had never understood that a woman trained in labor architecture could build refuge with the same precision she used to build empires. Roe Women's Workforce Trust would support assistants, junior managers, displaced staff, and women pushed out through polished executive cruelty that never looked cruel on paper. It would provide legal navigation grants, transition stipends, encrypted documentation review, and access to a confidential leadership abuse registry governed by the Equity Safe Harbor Charter. Danica signed the final operating mandate at 7:23 a.m. The only sound was the clean glide of her black stylus across the glass signing pad. In Charles's bright suite, Audra Phelps stood near the teleprompter in a cream silk dress, asking whether the cameras would still capture her from the left side. Charles gave a short, amused breath, trying to act as if control had not begun slipping through language he could not command. In Danica's darker office, Kira placed the evidence pouch beside the new trust papers, and the broken graphite sleeve looked smaller now, less like humiliation and more like a receipt. At 7:31 a.m., Oraline's legal desk transmitted the next notice to Fenwick Group: activation of human capital governance lien and interim transfer of senior workforce oversight. The notice did not accuse. It recalibrated. It placed all senior hiring, executive suspension review, ethics escalation, and leadership risk scoring under Oraline's independent governance until the review closed. Charles read the line 3 times and still reached for the wrong conclusion. "She cannot touch my people," he said. Marston Pike did not look up from the tablet. "They were never only yours." Outside, snow dragged across the windows of both towers, softening the city into a painting of white streets and gold rectangles. Charles remained under light, smiling at a room that no longer believed him, while Danica sat in shadow with documents that needed no audience. She opened a second file titled Source Logic Custody Warrant and authorized protected transfer of the leadership risk model, succession mapping code, and executive ethics triggers into Roe Governance Reserve. The system accepted her biometric seal at 7:38 a.m. On the screen, one sentence appeared: custody confirmed. Kira exhaled quietly, as if the air had finally returned to her body. Danica turned the ivory file clip engraved D. Roe toward the window, letting the pale morning light touch the name she had carried before Charles ever learned how useful she could be. At Fenwick Group, the teleprompter still displayed the phrase humane leadership in bright white letters, but no one was reading it anymore. At Oraline, Danica closed the trust binder and placed it beside the evidence pouch. "We build the door," she said. At 8:04 a.m., the Humane Empire Initiative was still scheduled to begin, But the snow outside Fenwick Group's tower had turned the city into a muted field of white roofs, dark bridges, and gold office lights fading behind the storm. Charles Fenwick stood beneath the studio lamps with his practiced smile restored, one hand in his trouser pocket, telling a room of communications staff that investors admired confidence more than paperwork. Across the river, in Oraline's colder tower, Danica Bexley sat beside Kira Donnelly at a long graphite table, reviewing partner response reports under a dim strip of blue morning light. The split was merciless. Charles laughed under clean artificial brightness, surrounded by teleprompters and borrowed optimism. In the shadowed calm of Oraline, Danica watched the first pillars of his empire begin to lean. At 8:09 a.m., the first major partner postponed its workforce integration renewal, a $640 million service alignment Charles had personally promised would close before noon. At 8:12 a.m., a Boston pension advisory group requested a culture exposure appendix before releasing its next allocation. At 8:17 a.m., a West Coast technology client suspended executive onboarding until Oraline completed its leadership risk review. "They'll come back," Charles said. No one answered. Marston Pike stood near the glass wall with his tablet angled away from the cameras, reading notices that arrived too politely to look fatal. Each message used the same language: pending review, interim caution, reputational clarification, governance continuity. None of them accused Charles directly, because elite institutions rarely slammed doors when they could close them with velvet gloves. The effect was worse. The private market desk on the 29th floor reported that Fenwick Group's credit spread had widened by 38 basis points in 40 minutes. The investor relations team said 3 calls had been moved from confirmed to tentative. A board member texted one sentence from Palm Beach: "Are we exposed?" Charles smiled toward the ring light, as if the light itself could rescue him. In Oraline's darker room, Danica opened the Reputation Risk Recapture Protocol dashboard, where partner confidence was displayed in thin, descending lines of amber and gray. Kira watched the numbers fall without cruelty, only with the stunned calm of someone seeing dignity translated into numbers. Danica did not celebrate. She simply authorized the release of the Independent Workforce Stewardship Notice to all covered partners. The only sound was the firm, digital chime of the governance seal locking into place. At Fenwick Group, the teleprompter froze on the words "humane leadership," and Charles tapped the remote twice before realizing no one was watching the speech anymore. Audra Phelps stood to the side in her cream silk dress, her smile thinning as she asked whether the press arrival could be delayed without making her look unprepared. She had expected flashbulbs, not basis points. She had expected a wife to disappear, not a system to answer. Charles turned on Marston, his voice low enough to preserve the performance and sharp enough to reveal the panic beneath it. "Fix the optics," he said. Marston finally looked at him. "This is not optics." Snow swept against the glass behind Charles, turning the skyline into a white blur while the studio lamps made his face look warmer than his position. At Oraline, Danica sat half in shadow, the city's pale stormlight resting on the ivory D-row clip beside her hand. She reviewed one final alert. Ethics breach, equity holdback engaged for executive incentive pool, estimated exposure $87 per million. Charles's bonus architecture, board reputation credits, and deferred leadership awards had been placed behind a governance gate he could not unlock by smiling. At 8:31 a.m., the communications chief quietly removed the livestream link from the company homepage. Charles saw the screen go blank. The only sound was the small plastic click of the teleprompter remote slipping from his hand onto the polished floor. In the silence that followed, the room around him remained bright, expensive, and useless. Across the city, Danica closed the dashboard, looked once at Kira, and said, "Let it breathe." At 9:18 a.m., the snow outside Fenwick Group had softened the rooftops into pale layers, but inside the communications suite the air had sharpened around every silent phone. Charles Fenwick stood beneath the studio lights with a thin, practiced smile, telling the remaining staff that postponed partners were simply waiting for stronger language. Across the river, inside Oraline's shadowed governance room, Danica Bexley sat beside Kira Donnelly, reading the sealed observer clearance report that had just arrived under Audra Phelps's name. The split was almost cruel in its symmetry. Charles stayed under light, smiling at words no one trusted anymore, while Danica stayed in the darker corner, motionless beside the snow-streaked window, letting the file speak louder than any accusation. At 9:22 a.m., Audra entered the suite holding her phone like a lifeline, her cream silk dress bright against the gray morning and her expression pulled tight around panic she was trying to rename as irritation. She asked why her name had been removed from the press seating chart, why her profile had vanished from the investor deck, and why the Executive Culture Committee no longer listed her as an incoming advisor. Charles told her it was temporary. "Everything is temporary," he said. Marston Pike looked up from his tablet, and the pause that followed made the sentence age badly. At Oraline, Kira opened the Observer Clearance Review, and the first page displayed a clean red mark beside Audra's proposed appointment. Conflict exposure, unmitigated. Danica did not smile. The report continued with the elegance of institutional rejection, noting lack of qualifying workforce governance experience, unresolved personal proximity to a covered executive, attempted access to a restricted personnel file, and a recorded pattern of demeaning behavior toward protected support staff. Audra had wanted a title. She had earned a finding. The only sound was the crisp tear of Audra's printed press badge splitting as the security chief removed it from the lanyard. She stared at the two halves in his hand as if silk, lighting, and Charles's favor should have protected her from documentation. Charles stepped closer to her beneath the studio lamps, still trying to perform tenderness while his eyes kept flicking toward Marston's screen. In the shadowed room across the river, Danica reviewed the next clause. Ethics breach equity holdback extended to affiliated reputational beneficiaries. It meant Audra's promised consulting retainer, appearance stipend, and advisory onboarding fee were frozen before a single payment cleared. The number was not empire-ending, only humiliatingly precise, $1. 8 million suspended pending governance closure. Audra read the notice on Charles's tablet and forgot to sound graceful. "You said she had no power left." Charles's jaw tightened. The room heard it. Snow pressed against the glass behind him, and the ring lights made his face look public while his situation became private in the worst possible way. Audra's voice rose just enough to lose the polished tone she used around donors, and she asked whether Danica had been the one controlling the people, the files, the models, the approvals, and the money all along. No one answered because the answer had become the architecture around them. Charles gave a small laugh, but it came late and landed poorly. "Danica was useful," he said. At Oraline, Danica looked at Kira, who had stopped typing. The word useful sat between them like something ugly placed on a clean table. Danica lowered her eyes to the graphite evidence pouch, where the broken authorization sleeve from the night before remained sealed under a barcode time-stamped 21:58 and 44 seconds Central Standard Time. She authorized its attachment to the reputation risk recapture protocol. The only sound was the low confirmation tone as the evidence file locked into the governance archive. At 9:41 a.m., Fenwick Group's largest leadership search partner sent notice of withdrawal from the upcoming executive succession cycle, citing independence concerns and reputational ambiguity. At 9:46 a.m., a New York institutional investor requested a special board call within 48 hours. At 9:52 a.m., the private communications team removed Audra's name from every internal briefing line, not out of morality, but out of exposure control. Audra saw it happen on the shared dashboard and turned toward Charles, no longer smiling, no longer decorative, no longer useful to the story he wanted cameras to believe. "Fix this," she said. Charles looked at her beneath the lights, then at the dead teleprompter, then at the staff who had begun to treat silence like distance. Across the river, Danica sat in shadow while the city glowed through the storm, her ivory D-row clip resting beside the open governance file. She did not need Audra to collapse beautifully. She only needed the truth to stand still long enough for everyone else to read it. "Now they see," Danica said. For years later, at 7:35 p.m., snow returned to Chicago with the same quiet discipline, falling over East Wacker Drive and softening the high-rise lights into gold, blue, and silver behind the glass. Inside the Rowe Women's Workforce Trust Leadership Forum, Danica Rowe Bexley stood beneath a narrow wash of warm stage light. wearing a deep red tailored gown with a clean neckline, her posture still, her face composed, her beauty sharpened by everything she had built without asking permission. 15 floors below, a black car waited at the curb with Charles Fenwick inside, his face half lit by the dashboard and half swallowed by the dark, his phone screen showing her name in the event program like a verdict printed in elegant type. The split screen had changed, but not softened. Charles sat in shadow, practicing a smile he no longer trusted, while Danica stood in the light of her own institution, silent before 800 women who knew exactly what it meant to be underestimated professionally, politely, and repeatedly. The forum was not a gala, not a charity spectacle, not one of Charles's camera-fed rituals of image repair. It was held in a renovated workforce law center on North LaSalle Street, with heated stone floors, matte oak walls, translation headsets on every sixth chair, and a live scholarship dashboard showing $92. $6 million distributed across legal navigation grants, emergency transition stipends, and executive abuse documentation support. Kira Donnelly, now Chief Operations Officer of the Trust, stood at stage left with a slim tablet and a calm expression that would have been impossible to imagine in conference room 7-8 years earlier. She was no longer waiting outside anyone's room. She held the room schedule. At 7:42 p.m., Danica signed the renewal of the Equity Safe Harbor Charter, expanding protected workforce funding into 9 states, and adding a new provision called the Dignified Exit Reserve, a financial bridge for employees who needed to leave powerful workplaces without being ruined by silence. The only sound was the smooth press of Danica's seal closing over the charter page. Applause rose slowly, then filled the hall, not loud in a cheap way, but deep, grateful, and steady. Outside, snow dragged across the windows, and the city lights behind Danica made her silhouette look carved from discipline rather than decoration. In the car below, Charles watched the live stream muted, smiling faintly when the camera found her, then stopping when he realized no one watching that room needed him in the frame. His empire still existed, but the governance winter had made it smaller, quieter, and watched. Fenwick Group survived through restructuring, board oversight, and the permanent presence of independent ethics monitors under the Reputation Risk Recapture Protocol. His name remained on buildings. Her name remained on futures. At 7:51 p.m., a security director approached Kira and murmured that Charles Fenwick had requested a private word after the program. Kira looked to Danica only once. Danica gave no visible reaction. After the last panel, she said. The last panel was titled Invisible Labor, Visible Power, and every woman on stage had once been called support, assistant, coordinator, or temporary by men who depended on them. Danica listened from the front row, hands folded, ringless now, the ivory D. row clip resting on the table beside her program like a small recovered flag. A former logistics manager described how the trust helped her contest a retaliation clause hidden inside a severance instrument. A junior finance analyst explained how a human capital governance lien had protected her evidence during a merger review. A single mother from Detroit said the Dignified Exit Reserve paid for 42 days of rent while she rebuilt her career. Danica did not cry. She breathed slowly, as if each testimony was proof that pain could become infrastructure when placed in disciplined hands. At 8:28 p.m., the program ended, and Charles entered through a side corridor in a charcoal suit that fit perfectly but no longer disguised him perfectly. He smiled under the hallway lights, the old reflex returning for 2 seconds, while Danica stood at the edge of a darker glass alcove, still and unreadable against the snowfall. The old split screen tried to return. It failed. Charles looked at the ivory D. row clip in her hand, and his smile weakened as if the small object carried more authority than any title he had kept. The only sound was the soft metallic click of Danica closing the clip over the signed charter copy. "Danica," he said, and for once her name sounded less like ownership and more like admission. She turned toward him without warmth and without hatred. Behind her, the forum lights dimmed one row at a time, while behind him, the corridor reflected his shape back in narrow strips of glass. Charles swallowed, then said he had watched what she built, that it was extraordinary, that he understood now how much of his world had been standing on her unseen labor. Danica held the charter against her side. "Understanding is late," she said. At 8:41 p.m., snow moved softly beyond the glass alcove on North LaSalle Street, turning the city lights into blurred gold threads behind Danica Rowe Bexley's reflection. Charles Fenwick stood 3 feet away, no cameras behind him, no PR chief feeding him language, no Audra Phelps waiting under flattering light to be introduced as the future. Danica held the signed equity safe harbor charter against her side, the ivory D. Row clip closed over its pages, and the small object seemed heavier than any ring Charles had ever placed on her hand. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Charles looked older than his photographs, not weak, not ruined, but reduced to the truth of himself without architecture, without applause, without the invisible labor he had mistaken for marital duty. He said he had come to apologize for that night at Oraline, for letting Audra humiliate Keira Donnelly, for laughing when he should have corrected the room, for treating Danica like a polished accessory while depending on her mind to protect his empire. Danica listened without softening. Outside, the snow slid down the window in slow silver streaks, and far below, traffic crawled along the wet black street like a quiet procession of witnesses. Charles said he had spent 4 years trying to understand how one woman could leave a room so quietly and still change the direction of a billion-dollar company by morning. Danica did not remind him that he had signed the governance instruments himself. She did not remind him that he had approved the executive conduct reversion instrument because it sounded impressive to investors, or that he had ignored the human capital governance lien because he believed systems existed to serve men like him, not restrain them. He already knew. That was the only apology time had made useful. Charles glanced toward the main hall, where Keira was speaking with young assistants, junior analysts, and displaced staff members who now had legal navigation grants, transition stipends, and a place to report polished cruelty before it became career damage. She looked strong, he said quietly. Danica's eyes stayed on Keira. She always was. The words landed gently, but they corrected him more completely than anger could have. Charles lowered his gaze. He admitted that Audra had left when the frozen stipends, suspended title, and reputational review made him less useful to her image. He admitted that Fenwick Group had survived only because the board accepted permanent outside oversight from Oraline Workforce Strategies, the very HR firm Danica had bought after he allowed another woman to shame her assistant in front of executives. He admitted that he had once believed humiliation was small if it happened to someone without a title. Danica turned then, and the hallway light caught her face with calm precision. That was your mistake. Charles nodded, and this time there was no defense behind it. He asked if forgiveness was possible. Danica looked through the glass at the snow, remembering 10:07 p.m., the brushed steel handle, the broken graphite authorization sleeve, Keira's stillness, Charles's smile under the warm lamps, and her own reflection standing in the dark half of the room. She had carried none of it as a wound anymore. She had built it into policy, funding, doors, salaries, protections, signatures, and safe exits. That was why she could answer without trembling. She said she forgave him for the marriage he wasted, for the silence he chose, for the insult he permitted, and for the years he thought her dignity was proof she could be overlooked. Charles closed his eyes briefly, as if forgiveness were the first warm thing he had heard all winter. Then he asked the question he had clearly rehearsed and feared. Could we begin again? Danica looked at him fully. There was no cruelty in her face. There was no longing either. Behind her, the last forum lights dimmed, and Keira's laughter rose faintly from the hall, steady and free. Danica placed the signed charter into Keira's hands as she passed, then turned back to Charles with empty hands and an unburdened heart. She had not bought his company's HR firm to destroy him overnight. She bought it to make sure the rules he once used for protection could finally protect someone else. She had not walked away to be chased. She had walked away to return to herself. Charles waited, still hoping consequence might eventually become invitation. Danica gave him the one gift powerful men often fear most, a final answer. Never again, Charles. Some endings do not need a slammed door. They only need a woman who finally understands that peace is not an invitation to return. Forgiveness can release the past without reopening it, and dignity can be quiet without being weak. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.